we are starting a new build series going over the meta builds and every single damage stat. So strength, dexterity, faith, intelligence, arcane. We're going to go through every single one, starting off with strength. Now, as of late, when I have been making build videos, I try to prioritize more fun or unique types of builds. But today we're just going to talk about the meta and try and just showcase the best of the best. There are like 15 different builds that could have made it onto this list. And if you guys do like this series, I could probably continue it and make a whole bunch more strength builds after this is all done. But just keep in mind, this is just going to be for PvE, and all the builds are showcased at level 150, but a lot of these builds are good for earlier game too. Now, every single time that you're making a build, I always recommend is having a projectile option, and with strength builds, you don't typically have many options there for you. You'd have the claw mark still and have options of different types of spells, but if you didn't really want to use spells, your only other option, in my opinion, would be things like the Smith Script Shield, which yes, is in the DLC, but you can very well pair this shield alongside every single strength build. You can just leave it in your back pocket, and its skill is a very nice projectile, goes very far, good at hitting enemies that like to move around a whole bunch, does decent damage for only 3 FP. Like if you were lacking a projectile option with your build, this could be something that you use. But anyway, that out the way, let's get started. You can't talk about the best strength weapons in the game without having to mention the Starfist, which is one of the best stance-breaking weapons. And the reasons being is because the heavy attack is so incredibly fast. Uncharged, fully charged, it does amazing damage because it actually has 2 weapons hit simultaneously, which typically heavy attacks with power stance combos don't do that, but fist weapons are paired types of weapons. So it's going to output amazing damage and do 33 stance damage for every single hit. So you can stance break faster with this weapon compared to almost everything else in the game. Now, there are plenty of different ways you can build around the Starfist. Now, for me, I'm actually going to go into some ease of use, pairing it alongside the Endure weapon skill, because Endure skill does give you a bunch of poise and 45% damage negation for 3 seconds, and it has a really quick animation, really cheap FP cost. You can just keep spamming the skill and then spamming the heavy attacks, and you're just not going to be able to get staggered out of it and just take a lot less damage. Now, Crackblade might just be the optimal option in terms of stance breaking or just doing more damage in general, but with the Endure skill, we actually can still pair it alongside another weapon buff. In this instance, we're just going to pair it alongside Bloodflame Blade, which actually does give you a flat 40 bleed buildup for each weapon, and being that it is a paired weapon, it just puts it onto both automatically. So every single one of these heavy attacks are actually doing a decent amount of bleed buildup, mainly because the weapon already does come with passive bleed. So the whole playstyle is just spamming Endure so you can tank attacks and just keep training out with the heavy. You're going to have the charged heavy attack buffs, and we also are going to have stuff for the multi-hit buffs, but you are also going to have the Dragon Crest Talisman, which is actually going to help us to tank even more attacks, because the entire build does involve us just having to trade out. You could also go with the Opaline hard tier as well if you wanted to play more into this playstyle. And as for the last slot, we are going to go with the Lord of Blood Exaltation Talisman. Now, if you actually were to fight enemies that were immune to bleed, I would go with the Blade of Mercy here instead, or the Crimson Sea Talisman before you actually got to the DLC. And with the strength build, you might as well throw in the Claw Mark Seal and use some spells. I just have things like Flame Grant Me Strength, Pest Threads for larger bosses. I do have Fire Serpent just as like a ranged based option, which doesn't really require much faith at all. And I do have Roar of Regalia as like an AoE damaging option. But honestly, spells are not really that necessary because your Starfist is going to be destroying every single boss really easily anyway. But having a projectile option always is nice. And you could also use damage negation buffs if you were fighting particular types of bosses that are just doing a bit too much damage to you. And also Golden Vow equipped onto a dagger. Just leave that into your offhand and just use it before every single boss fight. The Ordovis's Greatsword has one of the highest stance damaging skills in the entire game, and it is incredibly cheap and very easy to use. And it's to the point that it can just cheese basically every single enemy in the game. Now, yes, this is a strength-based build, and you might think the Ordovis's Greatsword is more strength-faith, but the strength scaling is way better than the faith scaling, to the point that even if you have like 60 strength, you're probably going to benefit of still putting more points into that stat, more so than actually going with the faith stat. And yes, even if you do account for the two-handed bonus, this is still the case, which even if you are going to two-hand it, I still recommend going at higher levels anyway, because skills don't get accounted for this two-handed bonus. But yeah, the entire build is just going around this skill itself, using things like the Shard of Alexander, Godfrey's Icon, and we are going to have the Blade of Mercy as well for every single time we get a stance break. And the Riposte, we just get 20% more damage. We can have the two-handed Talisman as well, which doesn't boost your skill damage, but the rest of your moveset is just a free 15% damage. And as for your crystal tiers, being that I am going to trade out a whole bunch, I'm going to go with the Opaline hard tier, just for some more damage negation. I do also have the Faith tier, just to give me plus 10 to face so I can actually meet the requirements of things like Golden Vow and Blessing's Boon, which is just more damage, damage negation, and health regen. As for your other damaging base spells, you honestly don't really need anything else. You probably want to have like one projectile option. You can just choose whichever one that you like. And you might think that if you do fight enemies that are really resistant to holy damage, you might want like a different damage type option. But this weapon is getting much more physical damage than it is holy damage, even with the skill, which does scale purely off AR. Now, if you were to fight bosses that only have 80 poise, I would recommend going with the stone barbed tier, because this weapon itself does get 66 stance damage, which means that all enemies like knights and omens get stance broken in just one hit, which is honestly just insane. But with the stone barbed tier, it pushes it over 80 stance damage, so enemies like Millennia, Godskin, Midra, Malekith, they can all get stance broken in just one attack. Now this crystal tier does only last 30 seconds, so I wouldn't have it on all the time. I would only just use it for these specific types of bosses, but that is another thing to just keep in mind. But yeah, the entire gameplay is just spamming the skill, which might seem boring to some people, but it doesn't change the fact that it's going to be one of the best options to use. The Rusted Anchor and the Pickaxe make for some of the best piercing damaging options in the game, because they're obviously really large and hard hitting types of weapons that just offer you piercing damage, which as I always mention is the best damage type, because lots of enemies are weaker to it, and in the middle of attack combos you're going to get bonus damage. Now it's always a toss up in between both as to which one is going to be the better option, because the Pickaxe is a regular great hammer, so it actually does get more stance damage, but the Rusted Anchor just gets more raw damage in general. But the funny thing is about the Pickaxe is that it can be power stance with great axes, so you can just honestly pair them together. Being that you can only get one Rusted Anchor per playthrough, this can be a very solid option, and the great axe power stance combos are really nice, as it do hit simultaneously. The jumping attacks can do high amounts of damage, so we're just going to play around this. Now I'm going to have the Pickaxe in my offhand and infused with Braggart's Roar. You can just use this every minute or just before a boss fight. It actually does give you 10% damage, defenses, and faster stamina recovery speed, which any single time that you're power stancing, Braggart's Roar might be one of the best, if not the best, offhand option. And in our main hands, we're going to have Prayerful Strike, because for the most part with this build, we're just going to be spamming jumping attacks and light attacks. So you only really need to have a skill just to serve as like utility and just to help further enhance the build. And just having a skill just for health regen is just going to be perfect. Every single time that you use the skill, you're doing 35 stance damage and getting 30% of your health back. And it's just going to scale off AR. It's not doing holy damage or anything. It's just straight up a bunch of health regen. Now, as for the skills, Shadow of Alexander to boost the skill damage, Claw Talisman alongside the Raptor Feathers chest piece to just enhance jumping attack damage. I am going to go with the Sword Insignia Talisman and things like the Thorny Cracks tier as well, because these things can result in like well over 30% more damage. And I do have the Faith tier to just help meet the requirements for things like Golden Vow and Blessing's Boon. But if you already do have things like 25 or 26 Faith, then you could go with like the Opaline tier instead. But as for the spells themselves, once again, you don't really need much, because this build is going to be just good against everything. Larger bosses, smaller bosses. You probably want to have something for like a range-based option, and that's about it. Lion's Claw alongside the Guts' Greatsword is like peanut butter and jelly. Just having both of them together just makes for an amazing pairing. Now, it's probably not going to be like the most optimal option. Putting Lion's Claw into a colossal weapon might just result in higher stance damage and potentially more damage, but the thing is, the Greatsword or the Guts' Greatsword actually can get you just as much damage as some colossal weapons out there, and it is going to have more range, and it's have the better moveset as well. Now, Lion's Claw is still not like the best damaging based option. In fact, things like Giant Hunt could just do more damage, do piercing damage for less FP, but the reason why Lion's Claw is so amazing is because it's so incredibly easy to use. From the very moment you click the button to use the skill, you're just never going to get staggered out of it, and you can trade out very easily with a lot of different bosses, flatten them all to the ground, do amazing stance damage. Like, it just makes for one of the most brain dead playstyles. Having things like the Shadow of Alexander, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, Crimson Steed Talisman +1, the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman. Like, you can use the base game versions until you actually get to the DLC, and you can switch to these ones instead. But all these talismans just help boost your neutral game by so much more. It's amazing for survivability. Having fast stamina regen is like one of the most important things in the game. It means you can just like spam your dodge just more often, and just pairing it alongside lots of endurance is going to be an amazing option too. Hence us having roughly 35 endurance, because our very large stamina bar is very noob friendly. But as for our crystal tiers, I do have the Faith tier to actually help meet the requirements for things like Golden Vow and Blessing's Boon, because I do only have 15 Faith. But if you already have 25 Faith or 26 Faith, you can just put in the stamina regeneration crystal tier instead. But yeah, we do have the Opaline tier just for more damage negation, because the entire playstyle is just trading out with bosses and is continuously spamming the skill. Now, obviously, with every single strength build, I recommend just using the Clawmark Seal paired alongside a bunch of different spells. I do have Catch Flame as a fire option for when you do fight those enemies where you get the fire damage. I have the Roar of Regalia, which is really good for AoEs. This spell can actually help stun lock these smaller types of enemies. And having things like Pest Threads or potentially Pest Thread Spears, once you do get to later levels, can just help melt all these larger types of bosses. And you could throw in things like Flame Gummy Strength just for some more damage. But going with the fortification spells against particular bosses that are hitting too hard might be a good option as well. The Sword Lance is the best strength weapon to come out of the DLC, and that is purely because this thing is a heavy thrusting sword and gets more damage than things like great axes and great hammers. Like, it can straight up outdamage the Rusted Anchor and get the exact same speeds and skill options that a heavy thrusting sword would have. Now, it actually does share the exact same heavy attacks as a great spear, which great spear heavy attacks are typically just slower than heavy thrusting swords, but one thing that it also does extend to is its guard counters. And the guard counters of great spears are way better than heavy thrusting swords due to them being faster and doing more stance damage. And with a weapon that's getting piercing damage, it just makes for an obvious option, because in most cases when you're actually getting a guard counter, it's probably in the middle of an enemy's attack combo, so you can just do monstrous amounts of damage with a build like this. And being that you get this in the DLC, you might as well just go slap on things like the two-handed talisman and the deflecting tier, and it just makes for such a broken and one of the best guard countering builds in the entire game. Now, if you didn't really care to go for guard countering, just using this build and slapping on something like Blood Tax or Impaling Thrust can be an amazing option. But this build is definitely centered around deflecting, as we are going to have things like the Two-handed Talisman, like I mentioned, the Curved Sword Talisman, the Great Shield Talisman, which actually does improve our blocking by roughly 20% in terms of stamina cost, which is going to be like the major downside when using like a deflecting build with the weapon that doesn't really get the best blocking, because even with the deflecting tier, you might still be able to take a little bit more stamina. But yeah, the best thing about the deflecting tier is not just the fact that you're just not taking much damage, but you actually can do up to 80% more damage and 50% more stance damage based on the amount of deflects that you actually get before getting a guard counter. So obviously you're getting lots of stance breaks really quickly, so might as well slap on the Blade of Mercy, which just does a bunch more damage after getting a critical attack. Now, as for our other crystal tier slot, I do have the Green Burst crystal tier, because when going with the deflecting builds, it might not be the best things in terms of stamina cost, so having something for stamina recovery speed is imperative in my opinion. And we are going to have the skill just infused with Cragblade, because we're not going to be using any different types of damaging skills, it's just going to be using the light attacks and guard countering. So in that essence, we don't really need to go into much higher strength, because we are just going to two-hand it the entire time, so we can put the rest of our points into Faith and just use a bunch of spells with the Clawmark seal. I have things like Fire Serpent, which is a good range option, Roar of Regalia is good for AoE, and Pest Threat Spears for those larger bosses, because typically deflecting builds aren't the best things for these larger types of bosses, but as for the rest of the spells, it's just going to be buffs. Okay, that is all the strength builds now talked about. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments. As for the next build video, it is going to be covering the dexterity builds. As I did mention, I do want to talk about some more other strength builds that are probably going to be more interesting than the ones that I talked about today, but that will probably end up being at a later date. But if that does actually interest you, just let me know how you feel down in the comments, and definitely do subscribe for them as well. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.